My name is Beverly, and I am 28 years old. 5 years ago, I stood in my childhood living room with a suitcase in my hand, listening to words that would shatter my world forever. My brother Kenneth looked me straight in the eye and said something so cruel, so final, that it still echoes in my mind today. What he said next changed everything, and when my mother nodded in agreement, I knew my life as I knew it was over. But here's the thing about rock bottom: it gives you a solid foundation to build your empire on. Today, those same people who threw me out like garbage are standing at my gates begging for a second chance. Before we dive into this story, I would love to know where you are watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and do not forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible true stories. Trust me, you will want to see how this tale of rejection turns into the ultimate comeback story. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, I thought I had the perfect American family. My father, Harold, worked at the local manufacturing plant for over 20 years, bringing home a steady paycheck that kept our modest three-bedroom house running smoothly. My mother, Doris, worked part-time as a secretary at the elementary school, always making sure dinner was on the table by 6 and our homework was checked every night. From the outside, we looked like the picture of middle-class stability. But inside our home, there was an invisible hierarchy that I never quite understood as a child. Kenneth, my older brother by 2 years, could do absolutely no wrong. When he brought home B grades, they were celebrated. When I brought home A grades, they were expected. When Kenneth decided to pursue engineering in college, my parents immediately started a savings fund and talked proudly to neighbors about their son, the future engineer. When I expressed interest in business school, I was told it was nice to have dreams, but I should probably consider something more practical. The differences became more obvious as we got older. Kenneth received a brand new car for his 16th birthday, while I was told I could use the old family sedan when needed. Kenneth got a full ride through college, with my parents covering his living expenses, textbooks, and even spending money for social activities. Meanwhile, I worked 3 part-time jobs throughout my college years, serving tables at a local diner, stocking shelves at a grocery store overnight, and tutoring younger students in mathematics, just to afford my tuition and basic living expenses. I studied business administration with a focus on entrepreneurship and marketing. Every semester, I would come home excited to share what I had learned about innovative companies, startup success stories, and the changing landscape of digital commerce. My family would listen politely, but I could see the glazed look in their eyes. They did not understand why anyone would want to take risks when safe, steady employment was available. Kenneth graduated with his engineering degree and immediately landed a position with a respected firm in our hometown. The celebration dinner lasted 3 hours, with my parents calling relatives to share the good news. When I graduated summa cum laude with my business degree, we went to Applebee's for an hour, and my mother spent most of the time asking when I planned to apply for administrative positions at local companies. I had bigger dreams, though. During my senior year, I had developed a business plan for an online platform that would connect small businesses with freelance marketing specialists. I had seen how many local businesses struggled with digital marketing because they could not afford full-time marketing employees, while talented freelancers were struggling to find consistent work. My platform would solve both problems while taking a small commission from successful project completions. When I moved back home after graduation, I thought it would be temporary, just long enough to save money on rent while I got my startup off the ground. I had $12,000 in savings from my college jobs, which I knew was not much, but I believed in my idea. I had already built a basic website, created a business plan, and even had informal commitments from several local businesses who wanted to be early adopters. My parents agreed to let me stay in my childhood bedroom for 6 months while I worked on getting my business established. They did not charge me rent, but they made it clear this was not a permanent arrangement. I was grateful for their support, even if it came with a countdown timer. Those first few months back home, I threw myself into my work with everything I had. I would wake up at 5 in the morning and work until midnight, only taking breaks for meals and family obligations. I was refining my platform, reaching out to potential clients, building relationships with freelance marketers, and trying to understand the legal and financial requirements for running a legitimate business. The isolation was harder than I had expected. While Kenneth came home each evening with stories about his coworkers' project deadlines and office politics, I spent my days alone in my bedroom staring at my computer screen and wondering if I was crazy for believing this could work. But every time I talked to a small business owner who was struggling with their online presence or connected with a talented freelancer who just needed consistent work, I knew I was onto something important. 6 months turned into 8, then 10, and my startup was still struggling to gain real traction. I had managed to facilitate a few small projects between local businesses and freelancers, earning tiny commissions that barely covered my basic expenses. My savings were dwindling rapidly, and the pressure from my family was becoming impossible to ignore. The family dinner conversations had shifted from polite interest to barely concealed frustration. Kenneth would come home from work and regale us with stories about his latest promotion opportunities, his growing retirement fund, and his plans to buy a house with his girlfriend Sarah. Then all eyes would turn to me, and the unspoken question hung in the air like a dark cloud: what exactly was I doing with my life? My mother started leaving newspaper clippings on my desk, job advertisements for administrative assistants, customer service representatives, and retail management positions. When I would find them there in the morning, I could feel the weight of her disappointment pressing down on my chest. She never said anything directly, but the message was clear: it was time to stop playing around and get serious about my future. Harold was less subtle. During one particularly uncomfortable dinner, he asked me point blank when I planned to move out and stop being a financial burden on the family. I tried to explain that I was not costing them any money since I bought my own food and contributed to household expenses when I could, but he waved away my protests. The real cost, he said, was the stress of watching me waste my education and potential on something that clearly was not working. Kenneth was the worst, though. He had started bringing Sarah around for family dinners, and he seemed to take particular pleasure in highlighting the contrast between our lives. He would talk about the mortgage pre-approval he had received, the vacation they were planning to Europe, and the new car he was considering purchasing. Then he would turn to me with a smile that did not reach his eyes and ask how my little computer project was going. The comments became more pointed as time went on. Kenneth would refer to my business as my hobby or my side project in front of Sarah and our parents. He would make jokes about his unemployed sister who was still living at home, pushing 30. When I tried to defend myself by explaining the potential of my platform and the positive feedback I was receiving from early users, he would nod condescendingly and suggest that positive feedback did not pay rent. I started avoiding family gatherings when possible, eating dinner alone in my room instead of facing another evening of subtle and not so subtle criticism. But I could hear them downstairs laughing and talking without me, and the sound made me feel more isolated than ever. I began to wonder if they were talking about me, sharing their concerns and frustrations about their disappointing daughter and sister. The self-doubt was eating me alive. During the day, I would work on my platform with desperate determination, but at night, I would lie awake wondering if everyone was right. Maybe I was being unrealistic. Maybe I should cut my losses and apply for a regular job like any sensible person would do. But every time I considered giving up, I would remember the small business owners who had thanked me for helping them find affordable marketing help, or the freelancers who told me my platform had given them their first steady income in months. Then something amazing happened. After months of networking and pitching, I landed my first major client, a growing restaurant chain that wanted to revamp their entire digital marketing strategy. The contract was worth $5,000, spread over 3 months, more money than I had made in the entire previous year of running my business. I was ecstatic, certain that this breakthrough would finally prove to my family that I was on the right track. I could barely contain my excitement as I sat down for dinner that evening, ready to share my incredible news with the people I loved most in the world. The moment I announced my $5,000 contract, I expected the room to erupt in celebration. I had practiced the words in my head all afternoon, imagining how proud my parents would look, how Kenneth might finally acknowledge that my business was legitimate. Instead, the silence that followed my announcement was deafening. Kenneth was the first to respond, setting down his fork with deliberate slowness. He looked at me with the same expression he might use when examining a suspicious piece of meat. $5,000 over 3 months, he repeated slowly. So that is about $1,600 a month before taxes and expenses. You do realize that is less than minimum wage if you are working the hours you claim right. I tried to explain that this was just the beginning, that landing one major client would lead to others, that I was building something sustainable for the long term. But Kenneth cut me off with a wave of his hand. Beverly, he said, using the patient tone someone might use with a small child, this sounds like one of those online scams. How do you even know these people are going to pay you? My mother chimed in with her own concerns. She worried that I was getting my hopes up over something that might not be reliable income. What would happen if the client decided not to pay, or if they were not satisfied with the work? How could I build a life around such uncertainty when there were plenty of stable jobs available for someone with my education? Harold nodded along with everything they said, adding that he had seen too many young people get caught up in get-rich-quick schemes that promised easy money, but delivered nothing but disappointment. He suggested that maybe it was time for me to consider this a learning experience and move on to something more practical. The conversation continued for what felt like hours, with my family systematically dismantling every aspect of my business plan, questioning every decision I had made, and expressing doubt about every future goal I had set. By the time we cleared the table, I felt smaller than I had ever felt in my life. But the worst was yet to come. 2 weeks later, my laptop crashed completely, taking months of work with it. I had been backing up my files, but the backup system had failed without me realizing it, and I lost crucial client communications, project documents, and development work on my platform. I needed a new computer immediately to fulfill my contract obligations, but I did not have the money for a decent machine. Swallowing my pride, I approached my father and asked if I could borrow $1,500 to buy a replacement laptop. I promised to pay it back as soon as I received payment from my client, and I offered to give him written documentation of the loan terms. I thought he would see this as a reasonable business expense and investment in my success. Instead, Harold exploded. He told me he was not going to throw good money after bad financing, what he called my fantasies. He said I had already cost the family enough in stress and worry, and he was not about to become financially invested in what was clearly a failing venture. Kenneth jumped in to support him, suggesting that this computer crash was a sign that I should cut my losses and apply for retail jobs before my resume gap became too embarrassing to explain. The argument that followed was brutal. I found myself defending not just my business, but my intelligence, my work ethic, and my right to pursue my own dreams. Kenneth accused me of being selfish and unrealistic, living in a fantasy world while my parents worried about my future. My mother said she was tired of watching me struggle and fail, when I could easily find a steady job that would give me financial security and peace of mind. I managed to borrow a laptop from Janet, my old college roommate, and completed my client work successfully. The payment came through exactly as promised, validating everything I had believed about my business. But by then, the damage to my relationship with my family was becoming irreparable. I started overhearing conversations that were not meant for my ears. My mother on the phone with her sister saying that Beverly was living in a fantasy world and refused to accept reality. My father talking to a neighbor about how difficult it was to watch your child make terrible decisions and not be able to help them. Kenneth telling Sarah that he was worried about what would happen to me when our parents finally stopped enabling my refusal to grow up. Each overheard conversation felt like a knife to my heart. These were the people who were supposed to believe in me, who were supposed to support my dreams even when they did not understand them. Instead, they saw me as a burden, a disappointment, a cautionary tale about what happened when someone refused to accept their limitations. The tension in the house became unbearable. I could feel their eyes on me every time I walked through the common areas, could sense their whispered conversations, stopping abruptly when I entered a room. I was living in a house with people who loved me, but had completely lost faith in who I was trying to become. The breaking point came on a Sunday morning in late spring. I had been living at home for almost a year, and my business was slowly gaining momentum. I had 3 active clients and was in discussions with several others about potential projects. More importantly, I had been invited to present my platform to a group of angel investors the previous week, and they had requested a follow-up meeting to discuss potential funding. This follow-up meeting was scheduled for Sunday morning via video conference, and I had prepared extensively for what could be the most important conversation of my professional life. These investors had the resources and connections to take my platform from a small local operation to a regional or even national business. I had dressed professionally, prepared detailed financial projections, and practiced my presentation until I could deliver it flawlessly. I was 15 minutes into what I thought was going very well when Kenneth burst into my room without knocking. He was still in his pajamas, his hair messy from sleep, and he was clearly annoyed about something. Without acknowledging that I was in the middle of an important video call, he started complaining loudly about the noise I was making so early in the morning. I tried to signal frantically that I was in a meeting, but Kenneth either did not notice or did not care. He continued his rant about inconsiderate people who did not respect that other people were trying to sleep in on weekends. The investors on the other end of the call could obviously hear everything, and I watched their expressions change from interested to confused to uncomfortable. I apologized profusely and tried to reschedule the meeting, but the damage was done. One of the investors made a comment about the importance of having a professional work environment, and I could tell they were having second thoughts about working with someone who was apparently operating out of their childhood bedroom while dealing with family drama. After the call ended unsuccessfully, I was devastated. This had been my best opportunity to secure the funding I needed to really scale my business, and Kenneth had destroyed it with his thoughtless interruption. When I tried to explain to him what had happened, he showed no remorse whatsoever. Instead, he suggested that if I had a real office like a real business, this would not have been a problem. That comment triggered the biggest family fight we had ever had. Within minutes, all 4 of us were in the living room. Voices raised, years of built-up frustration and resentment spilling out in the worst possible way. I accused Kenneth of sabotaging my success because he could not stand the idea that I might actually make something of myself. He accused me of being a selfish child who refused to accept reality. Then Kenneth said the words that would haunt me for years to come. He looked me straight in the eye, his voice cold and steady, and said, "No one wants you here, Beverly. You are 28 years old, living like a teenager, wasting everyone's time with this nonsense. Mom and Dad are too polite to say it, but I am not. It is time for you to grow up, get a real job, and stop dragging this family down with your delusions." I turned to my parents, desperately hoping they would defend me, that they would tell Kenneth he had gone too far. Instead, Harold nodded slowly in agreement. He said Kenneth had a point, that they had been patient long enough, and that maybe it was time for some tough love. But it was my mother's response that truly broke my heart. Doris looked directly at me, her expression sad but determined, and said quietly, "Kenneth has a point, honey. Maybe it is time you accepted that this is not working out the way you hoped it would." The room started spinning. I felt like I was having an out-of-body experience watching this scene unfold from somewhere far away. These were the people who had raised me, who had taught me to believe in myself, who had always told me I could accomplish anything I set my mind to. And now they were telling me that I was a failure, a burden, an embarrassment to the family. I do not remember making the decision to pack my things. I just found myself in my room throwing clothes and essential items into garbage bags and boxes. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely zip my suitcase. Every few minutes I would stop and listen, hoping to hear footsteps coming down the hall, hoping someone would knock on my door and tell me this was all a terrible mistake. But no one came. I could hear muffled conversations from the living room, but no one came to check on me. No one tried to take back the words that had been spoken. No one suggested that maybe we should all calm down and talk through this like a family. Kenneth's final words to me as I loaded my car were burned into my memory forever. He stood in the doorway watching me struggle with my belongings and said, "Do not come back until you have a real job and can contribute to this family like an adult." I drove away from my childhood home with nowhere to go, no plan for where I would sleep that night, and no idea how I was going to rebuild my life from the wreckage of that terrible morning. But as I watched the house disappear in my rearview mirror, I made myself a promise that would sustain me through the dark months ahead. I would prove them wrong no matter how long it took or how much it cost me. I would become so successful that they would regret every word they had spoken, every doubt they had expressed, every moment they had made me feel small and worthless. That night I slept in my car in a 24-hour diner parking lot, and I began planning my comeback. The next few months were the darkest period of my entire life. I spent the first week sleeping in my car, showering at a local gym, and trying to figure out how to continue running my business while essentially homeless. The humiliation was overwhelming. I had gone from living in a comfortable middle-class home to being genuinely unsure where I would sleep each night. Janet, my college roommate, finally rescued me by offering her couch for a few weeks while I got back on my feet. She lived in a tiny studio apartment an hour away from my hometown, which meant I was completely cut off from the life I had known. Janet was incredibly kind, but I could see the pity in her eyes every time she looked at me, and I hated being someone's charity case. I managed to maintain my existing client relationships by working from coffee shops and the public library, but growing my business became nearly impossible. How could I project confidence and professionalism when I was living out of garbage bags and borrowing someone's couch? I started applying for any job that would give me stable income and a permanent address, even positions that had nothing to do with my education or career goals. The job search was its own special kind of torture. I would sit in interviews wearing the same professional outfit over and over again, trying to explain the gap in my resume without revealing that I had been kicked out of my family home for pursuing my dreams. Potential employers would ask about my living situation, my references, my long-term career goals, and I would struggle to give answers that sounded remotely normal. I finally landed a position at a retail clothing store in the mall, working 40 hours a week for barely above minimum wage. The irony was not lost on me that this was exactly the kind of job my family had been pushing me toward, but now I was taking it out of desperation rather than choice. I would spend my days helping customers find the right size jeans or processing returns, then go back to Janet's apartment and work on my business until 2 in the morning. The physical and emotional exhaustion was crushing. I was working nearly 80 hours a week between my retail job and my business, sleeping 4 or 5 hours a night, and constantly stress about money, housing, and my uncertain future. There were nights when I would cry in the store bathroom during my break, overwhelmed by how far I had fallen and how impossible it seemed to climb back up. But something remarkable happened during this period of rock-bottom desperation. I met Gerald Morrison at a local business networking event that I almost did not attend because I felt like such a fraud. Gerald was a successful entrepreneur who had built and sold 3 companies over the past 20 years, and he was known for mentoring young business owners. I was standing by myself near the refreshment table, feeling completely out of place among all the successful professionals when Gerald approached me and started a conversation. He asked about my business, and something in his demeanor made me feel safe enough to be honest about my struggles. I told him about my platform, my vision for connecting small businesses with freelance marketers, and the challenges I was facing trying to grow the company while working a survival job. Gerald listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and offering insights from his own experience. By the end of our conversation, he had offered me a part-time position at his consulting firm, working 20 hours a week, helping his team with digital marketing strategies for their clients. The pay was decent. The work was directly related to my skills and interests, and most importantly, Gerald believed in my potential. Working with Gerald changed everything for me. He became not just an employer, but a mentor, teaching me about business strategy, financial management, and the practical realities of building a sustainable company. He encouraged me to continue developing my platform while gaining real-world experience with his established clients. More importantly, Gerald helped me rebuild my confidence. He would review my business plan and offer constructive feedback instead of dismissive criticism. He introduced me to other entrepreneurs who had faced similar challenges and overcome them. He helped me understand that the path to success was rarely linear and that setbacks were opportunities to learn and grow stronger. With the stability of Gerald's part-time position, I was able to quit the retail job and focus on work that actually mattered to me. I moved out of Janet's apartment and into a tiny studio of my own, nothing fancy, but it was mine. For the first time in months, I had a permanent address, a workspace where I could take client calls without embarrassment and a sense that I was moving forward instead of just surviving. I threw myself back into building my business with renewed determination. I used everything I was learning at Gerald's firm to improve my own platform, applying professional business practices to what had previously been a somewhat amateur operation. I developed better systems for client communication, more sophisticated pricing strategies, and clearer contracts that protected both my business and my clients. 6 months after starting with Gerald, my monthly income from my platform finally exceeded what I was earning at his firm. It was a milestone I had been working toward for over 2 years, and reaching it felt like validation of everything I had sacrificed and endured. I was not rich yet, but I was finally making a real living doing work that I loved and believed in. The success felt hollow, though, because I had no family to share it with. When I had lived at home, even during the worst arguments, I had always imagined that someday my parents would see my success and feel proud of what I had accomplished. Now that I was actually succeeding, the silence from my family was deafening. 2 years after being kicked out of my family home, my business had grown beyond anything I had dared to imagine during those dark, early days. What had started as a simple platform connecting local businesses with freelance marketers had evolved into a comprehensive digital marketing agency with clients across 3 states. The transformation had been gradual but relentless. Each successful project led to referrals. Each satisfied client became a case study that attracted new business, and each challenge I overcame made me a stronger and more capable business owner. Gerald had been instrumental in this growth, not just as a mentor, but as a sounding board for major decisions and a source of valuable industry connections. By the end of my 2nd year, I had hired my first full-time employee, a talented marketing coordinator named Paula, who had been freelancing through my platform for months. Having an employee felt like crossing a threshold from side project to legitimate business. I was no longer just working for myself, I was creating opportunities for others and building something that could exist independently of my constant personal involvement. The financial milestones came quickly after that. My 3rd year in business, I signed a contract with a regional hospital network that was worth more than my father had made in his best year at the manufacturing plant. The irony was not lost on me that the same family who had dismissed my business as unrealistic fantasy was now earning less annually than I was making from a single client relationship. I moved my business into a proper office space, a beautiful suite in a modern building downtown with space for 6 employees and room to grow. Walking into my own office for the first time, seeing my company name on the door and my business plan turning into physical reality, was one of the most emotional moments of my professional life. The media attention started in my 4th year. A local business journal wrote a feature article about young entrepreneurs who were reshaping the regional economy, and my company was prominently featured. The article led to speaking engagements, award nominations, and eventually a spot on a national list of rising entrepreneurs under 30. Each new level of success brought its own set of challenges and opportunities. I was featured in Income magazine as part of their annual list of innovative small businesses to watch. I was invited to speak at conferences about digital marketing trends and entrepreneurship. Major corporations started reaching out about potential partnerships and acquisition opportunities. But perhaps the most satisfying milestone was personal rather than professional. I bought my first luxury car, a sleek black BMW that represented everything my family had said was impossible for someone pursuing my path. I remember sitting in the dealership signing the paperwork with money I had earned through my own vision and hard work, thinking about all the times Kenneth had made jokes about my unrealistic dreams. I moved into a beautiful apartment in the best part of the city, with floor-to-ceiling windows, high-end appliances, and enough space to host dinner parties for my growing network of professional contacts. The apartment cost more per month than my parents had ever paid for their mortgage, and every time I walked through the front door, I felt a mixture of pride and sadness. The success was real and substantial, but it felt incomplete without the people I had once been closest to. I would achieve major milestones and reach for my phone to call my mother, then remember that we had not spoken in over 2 years. I would close important deals and want to celebrate with family only to realize that my professional success had come at the cost of those personal relationships. Social media made the isolation even more painful. I could see Kenneth's posts about his own life, his engagement to Sarah, their house purchase, family gatherings, where I was conspicuously absent. I learned about my parents' lives through mutual acquaintances, hearing secondhand about my father's health issues, my mother's retirement from the school system, family events that I was not invited to attend. There were moments when I considered reaching out, swallowing my pride, and trying to rebuild those bridges. But then I would remember Kenneth's words. The look on my mother's face when she agreed that I needed to face reality, the complete absence of support during the most difficult period of my life. I was not ready to forgive, and I was not sure I ever would be. My business continued growing, expanding into new markets and service areas. I hired a sales team, a dedicated customer service department, and specialized technical staff. What had started as a one-person operation run from my childhood bedroom had become a multi-million-dollar company with dozens of employees and hundreds of satisfied clients. The financial security was incredible, but the personal cost was becoming harder to ignore. Success without family to share it with felt like winning a race where you were the only participant. I had proven that I could build something significant, that my vision had been correct, and their doubts had been wrong. But the victory felt hollow when there was no one from my old life to witness it. Then 3 years after walking out of my childhood home with everything I owned packed into garbage bags, my phone rang with a call that would change everything once again. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in October. I was in my office reviewing quarterly financial reports that showed our best performance yet when my assistant Paula knocked on my door to tell me my mother was on the phone. For a moment I thought I had misheard her. I had not spoken to anyone in my family for 3 years, and the last words we had exchanged were hardly cordial. My hands were shaking as I picked up the phone. My mother's voice sounded older, more fragile than I remembered. She started with awkward small talk about the weather and my health, dancing around whatever had prompted her to break years of silence. Finally, she got to the point with a directness that reminded me of the mother I had grown up with. Harold had been laid off from the manufacturing plant after 25 years of service. The company was downsizing, moving operations overseas, and employees over 50 were being offered early retirement packages that barely covered basic living expenses. Kenneth's engineering firm was also facing budget cuts, and his position was far from secure. The family was facing financial difficulties they had never experienced before, and they were running out of options. The conversation was painfully awkward. My mother was clearly struggling to ask for help from the daughter they had rejected so completely, but desperation had overcome pride. She wondered if I might know anyone who could help Harold find work, if my business connections might include companies that hired experienced manufacturing workers. I listened to her carefully, hearing not just her words, but the fear and uncertainty underneath them. This was the same woman who had nodded along when Kenneth told me I was wasting everyone's time, the same mother who had suggested I needed to face reality and give up my dreams. Now she was asking me to use the professional network I had built through that same dream to help the family that had kicked me out. My first instinct was to hang up the phone. Part of me wanted to tell her exactly what I thought about their sudden interest in my connections now that they needed something from me. Part of me wanted to remind her of every cruel thing that had been said, every doubt that had been expressed, every moment they had made me feel worthless and unwelcome. But as I sat there listening to my mother's voice, I realized something important about myself. The success I had built was not just about proving them wrong, It was about becoming the kind of person who could rise above the pain and choose grace over grudges. I had spent 3 years building not just a business but a character, and this phone call was a test of who I had become. I told my mother I would see what I could do. I did not make any promises, and I did not pretend that our relationship could simply resume where it had left off. But I agreed to use my connections to help Harold find employment, not because they deserved my help, but because it was the right thing to do. Over the next few weeks, I quietly reached out to clients and business contacts who might have opportunities for someone with Harold's experience. I was careful not to reveal my personal connection to his situation, presenting him simply as a qualified candidate who had been affected by corporate downsizing. Within a month, I had found him a position with better pay and benefits than he had ever received at the plant. Harold never knew that his new job had come through my efforts. I asked the hiring manager to keep my involvement confidential, not because I was ashamed of helping, but because I wanted my father to succeed on his own merits, rather than feeling indebted to the daughter he had rejected. But word traveled quickly in our small town, and eventually the family learned about my role in Harold's new position. Kenneth was the first to reach out, sending me a Facebook message that attempted to bridge years of silence with an awkward apology. He acknowledged that he had been wrong about my business, admitted that he had been unfair and hurtful, and asked if we could possibly start over. The messages and calls that followed were a mixture of genuine remorse and transparent self-interest. My parents wanted to rebuild our relationship, but they also wanted to understand how their daughter had become so successful when they had been so certain she would fail. Kenneth was curious about my business model and wondered if there might be opportunities for partnership or employment. I was careful about how I responded to these overtures. I was not ready to simply forgive and forget, but I was also not interested in holding grudges that would only poison my own peace of mind. I agreed to meet with them, but on my terms and in my space. The first family dinner in 3 years took place at an upscale restaurant that I chose and paid for. Seeing my parents and Kenneth again was surreal. They looked older, more tired, somewhat diminished by the financial stress they had been experiencing. I arrived in my BMW wearing a designer suit that cost more than they used to spend on clothing in an entire year. The conversation was stilted and careful, with everyone trying to navigate the enormous elephant in the room. They asked polite questions about my business, my apartment, my life, and I gave polite answers that revealed very little about the emotional journey I had been through. Kenneth made several attempts to joke about the old days, but the humor fell flat when we all remembered how those old days had ended. What struck me most was how much our roles had reversed. They were now coming to me for advice about financial planning, career decisions, and business opportunities. The daughter they had once dismissed as unrealistic and naive was now the most successful person in the family, and they were struggling to adjust to that new dynamic. I helped them in ways both large and small. I provided Harold with professional networking opportunities that led to additional career advancement. I hired Kenneth's firm for a consulting project that helped stabilize their finances during a difficult period. I offered my mother advice about retirement planning and investment strategies, but I also maintained clear boundaries about what our renewed relationship would look like. I was willing to be helpful and cordial, but I was not ready to pretend that the past had not happened. The trust that had been broken would take time to rebuild, if it could be rebuilt at all. The most important realization that emerged from this process was that my success had given me something more valuable than money or professional recognition. It had given me the power to choose how I wanted to respond to the people who had hurt me. I could choose revenge or forgiveness, bitterness or grace. And that choice said more about who I had become than any business achievement ever could. I chose forgiveness not because they deserved it, but because holding on to anger was a burden I no longer wanted to carry. I chose to help them not because they had earned my assistance, but because success had taught me that lifting others up was more satisfying than keeping them down. But most importantly, I chose to maintain my independence and self-respect. I would be a loving daughter and sister again, but I would never again allow their opinions to define my worth or their doubts to limit my dreams. The little girl who had once desperately needed their approval was gone, replaced by a woman who had learned to validate herself through her own achievements and values. Looking back now, I can honestly say that being kicked out of my family home was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to develop the resilience, determination, and self-reliance that became the foundation of everything I achieved afterward. The rejection that felt like the end of the world turned out to be the beginning of the life I was meant to live. My family and I have a relationship again, but it is different now. It is built on mutual respect rather than obligation, on genuine care rather than assumed loyalty. They have learned to trust my judgment and value my success, while I have learned to forgive their lack of faith without forgetting the lessons it taught me. The young woman who packed her belongings into garbage bags and drove away from everything she had ever known would be amazed to see where that terrible day ultimately led. Sometimes the worst moments of our lives are actually the first steps toward our greatest triumphs, and sometimes the people who doubt us the most end up giving us the motivation we need to prove them spectacularly wrong. Success is not just about achieving your goals, it is about becoming the kind of person who can handle both failure and triumph with equal grace. It is about learning that other people's opinions of your dreams matter far less than your own belief in your ability to make them reality. And sometimes it is about discovering that the family you build through your choices and values can be just as meaningful as the one you were born into. The most beautiful part of this story is not that I became wealthy or successful, but that I became free. Free from the need for anyone else's approval, free from the fear of taking risks, and free from the limitations that others tried to place on my potential. That freedom is worth more than any amount of money, and it is something that no one can ever take away from me again. What about you? Have you ever been in a situation where the people closest to you did not believe in your dreams? How did you handle it when family or friends tried to convince you to give up on something important to you? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. And if this story inspired you or reminded you of your own journey, please hit that like button and share it with someone who might need to hear it today. Do not forget to subscribe for more incredible true stories about overcoming obstacles and achieving the impossible. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember that sometimes the biggest favor someone can do for you is to stop believing in you, because that is when you learn to believe in yourself. I wish you all the courage to pursue your dreams, no matter who tells you they are impossible.